Hey everyone! Today I'm being joined by Dr. Alexander Wille. He's going to be talking us today about Chinese literature. Thank you for joining us.
Oh, thanks for having me.
So let's start with an easy question.
Right.
Can you tell us more about what you studied?
Yeah, so I studied Chinese literature and comparative literature, and specifically what my focus was on the short vernacular fiction of the 17th century.
Can you tell us what that is? What is short vernacular fiction?
Right. So in Chinese literature, we have two basic streams, right? And things kind of pass back and forth. But essentially, on the one hand, you have literature that's written in the classical language, which is very formalized, which is very terse, it's very concise language. And that's what a lot of the classic works of philosophy are written in. It's also the language of the bureaucracy. On the other hand, by the time you get to the period that I'm looking at, you see an emerging trend where people are trying to write in something that's a lot closer to the way people spoke at the time, right? And so this is where the vernacular fiction starts to emerge. The other point that I made, that it's short, is important because a lot of the fiction that we're familiar with, a lot of the most famous works of late imperial literature, are these very long form novels. They're 100 chapters long, they're 120 chapters long, they're 1,000 pages in translation, 2,000 pages in translation. They're great if you want to squish a tortoise, but they can be a little bit impenetrable. But there's also this really vibrant tradition of the short story. We're talking about things that are anywhere from 5-10 pages long to 30 or 40 pages long. And that's the kind of work that I was looking at.
Interesting. Could you give us maybe an example, one that you recommend for someone that wants to get into this type of literature?
Somebody really great to look at is Liu. He's a late 17th century intellectual. He produces a wide range of really fun stuff. He's creative, he's original, he's really funny in a lot of cases. He kind of reminds me a little bit of Oscar Wilde. And he's been really ably translated by a number of different people, but in particular, Patrick Hanan has a really great collection of some of Liu's stories that he published under the title A Tower for the Summer Heat. And that's a great place to get started. These stories are fun, they're mostly very accessible, they're funny, they're surprising, they're sexy. It's a great doorway to this kind of literature.
That's fascinating, thank you. Could you tell us, as a native English speaker, what were some of the challenges you faced when studying these older works of Chinese literature?
Well, there's a handful of things, right? For me, some of the challenges that I faced were, first of all, in addition to the simple fact that as a native speaker of English, Chinese is always at least a little bit tricky. Beyond that, the fact that this literature is fairly old, it's several hundred years old, it's just describing a different world. And so there are things that the authors take for granted about what it means to be, just an everyday person living in one of the urban centers of China at that time. Just facts about getting around town, navigating the bureaucracy that are just completely novel to me. And so just getting my head in that space in a purely practical manner is always challenging. The other thing, and I mentioned earlier, there's this distinction between vernacular and classical Chinese, right? That even though we sort of, as a shorthand, tend to say, oh, this is a work that's in the classical language, this is a work that's in the vernacular. In fact, authors, at least vernacular authors, tend to dip into classical all the time. They'll include excerpts from documents, they'll insert descriptions in verse, and these are places where that dip back into the classical can really present an additional challenge, just in terms of getting your way into the language.
I see.
So these are things that can be challenges. They're fun challenges, right? I mean, I like reading classical. It's difficult but also rewarding, the way like a really good crossword is difficult but rewarding. It's this constant IV drip of frustrations but also micro moments of intellectual victory that's really nice. Yeah.
I got it. That sounds interesting.
Mhm.
Certainly in the West, we see in our popular culture today, from children's cartoons to action movies, references to fairly old pieces of literature. Is that the same in Chinese culture? Or if I was watching a Chinese drama or a Chinese children's cartoon, might I see references to these vernacular literature works?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And in fact, this is not only limited to modern day China, but in fact, to a certain extent, a lot of the most famous of these works have really entered not only the sort of the East Asian cultural heritage, but really the global heritage. And you know, two really good examples of this are Romance of the Three Kingdoms and Journey to the West. Romance of the Three Kingdoms is presented loosely as a sort of a historical tale of military conflict. But it's really become a sort of an almost universal text. We see it all over the place. It's frequently made into movies, into anime, into manga. We've been seeing video game adaptations of Three Kingdoms for, well, decades actually. And as for another example would be Journey to the West, I mentioned a moment ago. Journey to the West, you can kind of think of it as analogous to Arthurian legend, right? This is something that has these sort of tenuous historical antecedents, but it's being retold repeatedly over the centuries. And then going on into the modern period, we have even more sort of playful and fanciful retellings. Journey to the West is precisely the same way. It's being retold over the years, it's being retold in different media, different genres. Its most famous character is Sun Wukong, otherwise just known as Monkey, right? And I think we've all seen probably images of Monkey. He's got the gold circlet on his head, he's got the magic staff, and he shows up in explicit retellings of Journey to the West. It seems like we have a new movie version of the novel or some elements of the novel from about every 6 months to a year, coming out of either China or Japan. And he even shows up in more unexpected places. The anime series Dragon Ball Z is extremely loosely inspired by characters from Journey to the West. And so I think what people find is this stuff is out there, and it's becoming increasingly part of just like the global cultural fabric in a really interesting way.
Well, that's fascinating. One last question for you. If you could travel to any point in Chinese history to better understand a work of literature or a historical event or perhaps the motivations behind a writer's work, when would you want to go? What would you want to see?
That's a great question. The honest answer is 1620 Suzhou. My dissertation work was on a collection of 40 vernacular short stories that were published this year in Suzhou, one of the major cultural centers of China at this time. And so much of these stories are, well, ostensibly they're set in previous dynasties, but really they're descriptions of day-to-day life in the late Ming dynasty that are sort of cosplaying as tales from earlier dynasties, right? And so much of these stories just revolve around the experience of people walking around the cities, just having encounters in the street. I have this vision of this place that's been in my head for a long time now, that's like based on a combination of the stories themselves as well as visiting the city in the present. But to be there in person, to hear people walking around, to see people selling things on the street, to be able to just duck into a bookstore and see what that's like, to be able to duck into a tea house and see people having conversations and maybe somebody doing some professional storytelling in the corner for money. it would be great. Is it going to answer some huge historical question that nobody has any access to? Not necessarily, but it would make me happy.
Well, that's an excellent answer. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me
Well,
today.
it's been my pleasure. It's been really fun.